Real Stories Tapes True Crime is your new true crime podcast fix. In our first season, we'll explore suspicious deaths at a California hospital and a skydiver landing dead on a suburban driveway with a bag containing guns, drugs, and night vision goggles. To join our investigation, search and subscribe to Real Stories Tapes True Crime on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you find your podcasts.
Over the course of this series, we've been looking at gangs, old and new, from across some of Britain's cities.
Gangs have risen and fallen. They prosper now as they've always done. They continue to find new ways of making money and fending off their rivals.
We've seen how you joined gangs, how they operated, what they stood for. We've learned how they've moved from gambling into clubs and protection, and now into drug importation and dealing.
But is there a pattern to criminality? Are there similarities between these gangs? Or are they solely products of their era?
We're going to look at the reasons why we have gangs, how they make their money, how they hold on to it, and what has been done to try and break them. Gangs have always been with us, and it's easy to see why. They offer self-preservation, comradeship, a sense of belonging. For some, joining a gang means prestige, and for a few, it means power. But there are countless reasons beyond the pack instinct why people join gangs. In the 19th century, living in one of Britain's industrial cities, it was an alternative family, a home on the street away from the overcrowded slum. The gang could also give you respect. But that you'd have to earn. On the streets of Manchester in the late 1800s, you could earn respect as a scuttler. Long before there were hoodies and scallies, there were the scuttlers, the first youth cult. I'm about to meet a man who I hope can tell me a little bit about them. Andrew Davis is a historian and author who has researched the gangs of Manchester. So Andrew, tell me about the scuttlers. What were the scuttlers?
Scuttlers were gang members. They were young lads, working class lads, aged in their teens, more or less from the age of leaving school up to sort of 20, 21. And scuttler was a very specific term. It meant you were a gang member. It meant you had a certain look. It's a slang term with its origins on the streets.
So what would they do? Would they be stealing, or were they running gambling, or...?
Scuttling gangs really are territorial gangs. They're neighbourhood or street gangs, and really they're fighting gangs rather than criminal gangs. They're usually named after the street, maybe the thoroughfare where they would gather on the corners. So it would be an area-based name. So you might have a gang from Hope Street, Salford. The most famous gangs had more exotic names. There was a gang from Ancoats from Bengal Street who went under the name the Bengal Tigers. Wow. So they're looking to invest a little bit of glamour, something exotic in their activities.
And is that all it was really about? Sort of just respect and power?
It's very much about pride in your area, and it's about pride in yourself and your friends as well. So a lot of this is about keeping young people from other districts outside what you define as your patch.
Scuttlers became the first youth cult. They had a distinctive look. Short hair, but with a long fringe. Worn in a parting and plastered down with soap on the forehead over the left eye. The dress signalled to everyone that a scuttler was no ordinary working class lad, but a street fighter. It was one thing to look dandy and impressive, but some of their dress had other, more vicious functions. For example, these clogs, heavy, pointed, and with brass toe caps, good for close-up combat. Their belts were another part of their armoury. They would have a heavy brass buckle, which they'd sharpen along the edge, so it became like a blade. They'd also bang nails or bolts through the end to add more weight when swung. It was said that a hit from one of these could split a man's skull.
And was the fighting just random, just people just getting angry and attacking people, or was there was an order to the way they fought?
I think it's very, very targeted. One of the things that you realise about Scotland is they all know each other. The gangs would actually chalk the threat or the invitation to fight. They'd chalk the challenge either on a wall or maybe on the pavement. So there would be a day and a time, Saturday, 3 o'clock, Adelphi against Greengate. So it really is battling by appointment. They're very often carrying and they're using knives as well. But it's very, very rare that anybody gets killed. So generally what they're looking to do is to maim or to scar.
The Scuttlers fought for little but their own respect. They simply liked fighting. They liked proving how tough they were. They didn't make any money out of it. There was no master plan. But in other cities, street gangs could be very different. Glasgow was once the most overcrowded city in Britain, as well as the poorest. In the late 1800s, immigrants from Ireland, fleeing the second wave of the potato famine, came to work on Clydeside. They formed large Catholic neighbourhoods in the Protestant city. For many, their arrival was unwelcome competition and created resentment, hatred, and in some cases, violence. One area which became a flashpoint bordering Catholic districts was called Bridgeton, or Brigton. And this was home to an infamous Protestant gang, the Brigton Boys, soon to be known as the Billy Boys. They took their name from William of Orange, the Dutch-born king who in the 17th century annexed Northern Ireland and installed the Protestant church. The Billy Boys were devotees of King Billy.
Legend has it that the gang was formed in 1924 by a man who came from this street. His name was William Fullerton.
Billy Fullerton, who formed them, according to the story, was beaten up by a gang of Catholics when he was in his late teens, and he decided that he would form his own gangs to basically anything they could do, he could do bloodier.
In the 1930s, the rivalry between the Protestant and Catholic was played out on the football pitch, with the west of the town supporting Rangers and the east supporting Celtic.
In spite of the weather, we saw Celtic trying their skill against the Rangers. Celtic kicked off and run straight into the attack.
The Billy Boys used their loyalty to Rangers as a way of attacking Catholics.
Real trouble breaking out on the terraces here.
They would infiltrate the Rangers fans to provoke battles with Celtic supporters.
The referee has stopped the match, as they would have to do, of course.
The sectarian gangs of Glasgow, like the Billy Boys, were not alone. Immigrants always faced opposition across Britain's cities.
The Irish settled in Liverpool and also by the docks in London. But there wasn't just the Irish. Italian immigrants settled in Clerkenwell, Russian Jews in Whitechapel. And even today, there are still immigrant gangs around the country. Tensions could snap at any time. In Southall, West London in 1976, they did just that, with the stabbing of an Asian student by a white gang. Young Asians who had put up with attacks from Teddy Boys now had to face much more powerful groups, like the National Front. The Asian community defended itself by forming gangs. I'm meeting up with a man who has done a lot of research into this, journalist and crime writer, Tony Thompson. First of all, tell me about, when did gangs first emerge in this area?
Well, around the Southall area, they really started around the late 60s, early 70s, which was around the same time that we started to get a large population of people from the Indian subcontinent coming to this part of London and setting up shop here. In the early days when they were being here, there was a lot of racism, a lot of people being attacked by sort of people like the National Front and so on. And they started to defend themselves by gathering together in vigilante gangs to defend themselves against the racists. But what happened was once the threat from the racists started to fade a little bit, those gangs stayed around, started attacking each other and started preying on the local community themselves.
And it was the same story in other cities. During the 1970s, the black community in Birmingham felt threatened. Just tell me a bit about why gangs started in Birmingham.
Well, originally the gangs, certainly the black and Asian gangs, started off as, you could say, almost vigilante gangs. There was a big problem with skinheads and the right wing in certain parts of Birmingham, and these gangs formed essentially to look after their own communities.
But in 1981, tensions exploded in vicious race riots. Heavy-handed policing only inflamed the aggression on the streets as groups of young black youths began to take the law into their own hands.
It kind of empowered a lot of the young black kids in that they thought, well, hang on, we've rioted, we managed to put the police on the back foot, you know, we can show some force when we want to. Eventually, as the right-wing threat dissipated, they kept that organisation together and it became more of a criminal network. As drugs started coming into the community, they used those bonds and those links they had and directed towards criminal efforts instead.
Once gangs have become established, it's not always easy to decommission them. What may have started as a means of protection can also become a means of making money. The revenues that can be brought in by using such a large number of loyal supporters can be too tempting to resist. During the First World War, times were tough. For many living in the northern cities, only the manufacture of armaments kept men in work. The wages they brought home were just enough to keep their families alive. Their future, what they could see of it, was bleak. Their only ray of hope in such depressed times was gambling. And in the city of Sheffield, that meant a game called pitch and toss. With local historian J.P. Bean, I've come to see where the gangs here in the 1920s made their money.
This is Sky Edge, an ideal place for pitch and toss, which one of the most simple forms of gambling, but here vast sums were bet. A man called Jack White, who was a publican from Barnsley, was known to regularly bet £50 on one single toss of the coin.
Huge sum of money.
Huge sum of money. The organisers of the ring took 4 shillings in the pound as a toll. The toller ran the ring. George Mooney here was the toller. So somebody put £1 on, the pound went on the floor as the bet, 4 shillings went in George Mooney's pocket.
Sheffield was not alone. There were pitch and toss rings all around the country. Gambling was big business. And in the 1920s, there was no greater gambling business than horse racing, turning over £500 million a year. Racetracks became an industry for the gangs. And the biggest gang who made the most was an outfit from Birmingham called the Brummagem. After the First World War, racecourses were the only legal gambling places. But the bulging satchels of the bookmakers attracted criminal gangs wanting a piece of the action, and the Brummagems wanted the biggest slice. I've come to meet a former member of the Met's flying squad, police historian Dick Kirby.
Dick.
Gary, delighted to meet you.
Yeah, good to meet you. So I suppose the first question is, what did the Brummagems see in racecourses? Why were they here?
Well, they saw an awful lot of money. In those days, before the First World War, practically anybody could set up as a bookmaker.
Oh, right.
There were no real rules and regulations, and the bookmakers just paid out if they could afford it. And if they didn't, they hired bodyguards to protect them from enraged punters who wanted their winnings.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The Brummagems soon got into every illegal trick in the book, as historian Carl Chin explains.
Blokes would go up to somebody and say, "Hey," to a bookie, "you're the bookie. Oh, give us 10 bob for poor old Fred, he's just come out of nick." Right. Poor old Fred hadn't come out of nick. Poor old Alf's just going into nick, give us 10 bob. Or else even cruder, if you don't give me £1, I'm going to turn you upside down.
Right.
So a lot of bookmakers hired minders, tough boxers. It was might rules.
I see.
And so whether you were bookmakers or punters, if gangs came along and preyed upon you, you were struggling.
And the gang that posed the greatest danger and controlled the most racecourses was the Brummagems. The gang charged bookmakers as much as 50% of their profits for the privilege of being left unmolested. In turn, some of the bookies began to use the gang's services to dissuade winning punters from pressing their claims for payment. You didn't have to run a national horse racing racket to make money. There was a living to be made out of good old honest thieving if a gang had enough men out on the street. And not all gang members were men. One gang, called the 40 Thieves from South London, was run by a formidable woman called Alice Diamond. In 1916, aged 20, Alice Diamond became queen of the 40 Thieves and would transform them. Dressed in specially tailored clothes complete with hidden pockets, Diamond and her crew raided some of the West End's biggest stores: Debenhams, D.H. Evans, Selfridges and Whiteley's. Diamond's girls dressed smart. They never wore any stolen goods, and they gave the impression they were cut from finer cloth. But underneath their glamorous outfits were hidden surprises. Their jackets had deep inside pockets to contain plundered goods. Tailored cummerbunds, muffs, skirts, and even hats sewn with hidden pockets. One key innovation was to wear extra voluminous knickers to hide their ill-gotten gains.
They had a name for the knickers, didn't
Yeah, they were called hoisting knickers, like from to hoist. And so that's how they got the name the Oysters.
But that's what I like, because hoister becomes oyster if you drop the H. The oyster knickers is great. I love that. I'm sure we could make them now.
They liked to steal small, exclusive things. Then there was lingerie, silk, designer clothes, furs, leather goods. It all just vanished.
How would they do a raid on, say, one of the shops here?
Well, what would happen? They'd arrive probably by car and park somewhere sneaky. And the car was very important. It needed a big boot so they could go backwards and forwards and load up. And they would all carry identical type bags and gradually go in the shops one by one. The first two would start loading the gear. The next person to come in would swap the bag and take the others out. And so there's only one chance of one person being arrested, while the others gradually moved around them. And sometimes they'd create a distraction, so they'd pretend to faint or if they were taken ill, and then cause a big havoc in the store. And so people were looking at the wrong thing. But actually, a lot of the technique was about rolling the stuff very small and packing it in. And you have to remember, nowadays we have very different types of technology. We have CCTV, we have all sorts of detection networks. Then it was a free-for-all.
Some gangs were not as subtle as the 40 Thieves. One gang who came to prominence was certain members of a Turkish Cypriot family from South East London. They were four brothers: Bakir, Mehmet, Dennis and Dogan.
In the 80s, the Arabs were kings. They were running everything. They seemed to be getting away with everything. Even when they got nicked, they got off. Yeah, they really were becoming legendary figures. But then in late 1990, everything started to unravel. They decided to hold up a security van in Reigate in Surrey. What they didn't realise was that one of their associates had tipped off the police, who in fact encouraged the entire robbery to still go ahead.
On the 27th of November, two of the gang set off. They tracked the Securicor van on its way to Reigate. The van was carrying large amounts of money to branches of Barclays Bank. Mehmet and Dennis Arif were on the job themselves, along with Dennis's brother-in-law and a hardened armed robber called Kenny Baker. They all tooled up with an assortment of guns. But unknown to them, the police were all on red alert. The Securicor van had become the bait, and the Arifs the catch. In the centre of Reigate, the Securicor van pulled over and came to a halt.
The security van has stopped. The man and woman security guard have got out to go and get a coffee, and the Arifs and their friends swoop, and they swoop with a vengeance. They were wearing Ronald Reagan masks, which must have been absolutely terrifying, because the police have turned up, because of course they knew about it, they were waiting. They were there planning to nick them all. This was in commuter belt town south of London. The police are not going to let go, they're going to get this mob if whatever happens. And unfortunately, one of the other robbers, Baker, was shot dead. The Arifs were nicked, and this was a pivotal moment for them. It was a pivotal moment because it was the beginning of the decline of the Arifs, because it broke the family up in a way they'd never been broken up before.
Mehmet and Dennis, together with their brother-in-law Anthony Downer, were arrested. Kenny Baker lay dead. Gang gangs made their fortune from just about every illegal practice going. But drugs were always going to bring in the most money. Drugs changed the face of gangland Britain. Some gangs, like the Tootie Nung, poured all their money into heroin. It all depended upon couriers, trusted friends or families from the gang, and usually women. They would be flown out of Heathrow to India or Pakistan. They would usually go for a few weeks and be able to visit their families and have a paid holiday. But on their return, they would bring back heroin. Boarding and body checks in Pakistan could be easily avoided. The gang wielded considerable power there. Officials could be bribed to turn a blind eye. But it was the return trip to Heathrow where the gang's ingenuity and planning would be critical. With vigilant customs officials and the latest scanning devices, it would be risky trying to smuggle the drugs through customs. But the Tootie Nung had a simple, undetectable and foolproof solution. When the couriers entered the baggage reclaim area, they would slip off to the ladies' toilets. There, they would remove the packages of heroin. Each courier had been given a key to the tampon dispenser. Here the drugs were hidden, and the courier, now totally clean, could pass through customs and leave the airport. Now, there was just one more link in the operation. The gang had people employed at the airport as cleaners. As soon as the couriers had cleared, their job was now to move and pick up the drugs. Once in their hands, it was no problem to take the drugs out of the airport. With so many people regularly going back and forth, nothing looked out of the ordinary. This operation didn't raise any suspicions. The Tootie Nung were bringing in 10 kilos a day, worth £100,000. They did this for 10 years. That's £365 million. Docks and airports. They open up all sorts of possibilities for gangs. They did for the Liverpool Mafia and for one gangster called Curtis Warren, a leading figure in an international drug smuggling ring who controlled much of Britain's cocaine business. In 1991, Warren flew to Venezuela to set up a big cocaine shipment from the Cali cartel. Just to give you an idea of the planning, the cocaine was shipped inside 32 lead ingots, this big. It meant that they couldn't be x-rayed, and to cut them open would take hours. It's also said that Warren knew the length of the drill bits that the customs used, 25 centimetres long. Now just take a look at this. 25 centimetres means you can't get anywhere near the centre. It was with such ingenuity he made the Liverpool Mafia Britain's first and most successful drug cartel. When the ingots arrived in England, customs cut one open, but found nothing and let the shipment through. Only then were they tipped off that they contained cocaine. But it was too late. The ingots were already on their way to Liverpool. Inside was the cocaine. Warren's cut was an estimated £87 million. Once a gang has cornered a market, it has to control it. It can't afford to let another gang push it off its turf.
Gangs have always controlled their members and territory with threats and with violence. Any breach of loyalty could be dealt with in the most brutal way, even by death. The worst conflicts have taken place when a gang has split into two groups. This divides not only the gang members, but the territory as well, putting both under intense scrutiny, each side watching for an opportunity to provoke or attack the other. Gang feuds can last for decades. The tit-for-tat violence that ensues often spills out, endangering the lives of innocent people. This is what happened in Sheffield in the 1920s. A gangster called George Mooney had run a highly lucrative and illegal pitch-and-toss betting ring at Sky Edge above Sheffield. But when he slimmed down his operation by laying off some of his henchmen, they formed a rival gang called the Park Brigade. They were led by a man called Sam Garvin. Garvin was a bookmaker, gambler and promoter of bare-knuckle boxing matches. He had amassed a string of convictions and prison sentences for assault, illegal gaming, con tricks and larceny.
Garvin was a professional criminal, first conviction in 1904, very well connected with local politicians. When the first very decent council houses were built in Sheffield, he got one, and there weren't many of them. In the depths of the Depression, when everybody's living in poverty, he drove a 3-litre Bentley saloon.
Now Garvin's gang, the Park Brigade, would begin a vicious feud with the Mooney gang and push gang warfare in Sheffield to a new level of violence, earning the city the name of Little Chicago.
They attacked one of the Park Brigade in his bed, a man called Bill Furness, one Saturday night in April 1923. They attacked him with hammers, severely injured him, never reported to the police, but there were reprisals. A few days later, one of the Park Brigade was coming away from here, away from the tossing ring, and was slashed with razors over 100 times. Wouldn't speak to the police, wouldn't say who'd done it. All it'd say was, I reckon they've spoiled me suit.
I reckon they had spoiled his suit.
They had spoiled his suit.
But the vendetta between the two gangs would culminate in the most violent attack Sheffield had ever seen. It would be an innocent man, a non-gang member called William Plummer, who was going to experience just how ruthless Sam Garvin's Park Brigade could be.
Princess Street, scene of the murder of William Plummer.
So tell me about William Plummer. Who was he? What did he do?
William Plummer was a 34-year-old Scotsman. He'd come to Sheffield after the First World War to work in the steelworks. Father of 3 children, he had no connection whatsoever with gangs.
But one evening, Plummer witnessed a violent fight. One of Mooney's men had been badly beaten, and Plummer had helped him to his feet. Unbeknown to him, the rival gang, led by Sam Garvin, now saw this as a reason to make him a target. Around 20 of Garvin's men hit Plummer with pokers, koshes, a piece of lead on a string, and this vicious weapon, ironically called a life preserver, a chair leg with nails in it. Although being badly beaten, Plummer managed to crawl back to the house, but as he struggled towards the door, he was then pounded repeatedly with a child's scooter. Plummer had severe head injuries and 2 great wounds resembling bayonet thrusts through his stomach and side. He was taken to the Royal Infirmary, where he died within minutes.
There'd been slashings, there'd been shootings, there'd been bludgeonings, but he was the first man to be killed. It was the first murder of the Sheffield gang wars.
It doesn't always have to be a split within a gang to create the violence. Rival gangs come up against the same brutality. In the 1950s, the Krays were a new breed of criminal, bringing with them a new type of violence, extreme and unpredictable. They were so terrifying, they made some gangs, like the Watney Streeters, simply run away.
This is where Reggie, Ronnie, Billy Jones and Bobby Ramsey came looking for the Watney Streeters who had done up Ramsey. What happened was the Streeters got wind that the Krays mob was on its way. In the front was a fellow who got nothing to do with it, but was related to the Streeters, a man called Terry Martin. Out the back go the Watney Streeters, whom the Krays are really looking for. And there's poor old Terry Martin in front, left really more or less on his own. He's dragged out and given a stabbing with the bayonet.
By who?
By
you know?
Ronnie, and possibly Bobby Ramsey. It's difficult to know who really does what, but they all give him a terrible hammer.
Just here on this pavement?
Just here on this pavement, yeah.
And where the Watney Streeters
have decamped, yes, very sensibly.
More recent gangs who deal in drugs are just as violent. Drug dealing kickstarts a miserable cycle of addiction, crime and violence. For the gangs lower down in the supply chain, control of their drug turf is crucial. At street level, the violence they dish out is to be seen and feared. Sometimes it spills out, ruining the lives of innocent people. This is what happened in Manchester with the Gooch Gang. This was the Gooch Gang leader, Colin Joyce, known as the General. And this is Lee Amos, the other top man. They've been described by one senior copper as psychopaths who shoot for fun. These guys were at war with the Doddington gang and the Longsight crew. And in 5 years of shooting, 250 people were wounded and 27 were killed. These tit-for-tat killings culminated in 2 brutal shootings. They would shock not only Manchester, but the whole country, becoming a landmark in gang violence and ultimately bringing about the downfall of the Gooch Gang. Our story begins at 6:45, 15th of June 2007, right here on the corner of Anson Road, Longsight, South Manchester. A young man called Ukal Chin was gunned down in a roadside ambush. I want to find out how this happened, how an innocent man got caught up in a gangland shooting. So we're here on Anson Road. Ukal Chin got shot here, right?
Yeah. He'd been driving about with some friends that day. Colin Joyce, one of the senior members of the Gooch Gang, was driving up and down looking for a Longsight crew member or associate to go after. Somewhere along Anson Road, he spots Ukal Chin. The vehicle that he's in draws parallel to the Renault that Ukal is driving and opens fire, and Ukal's killed. The likelihood is he was after Ukal.
Why? Because he thought he was part of Longsight?
Ukal came up in an area where gang membership is simply defined by who your friends are. You might have friends who are more involved than you are, but you become associated with their gang because they're your friends. They might be the friends that you went to primary school with. They might be the friends that you've grown up playing football with, but that's enough to label you, and if you happen to be driving these lads about on a particular day and your face becomes associated with them, then it's a question of perception. That was enough to get Ukal killed, unfortunately.
Just as Manchester had the Gooch Gang, Birmingham had the Johnson crew. Their callous displays of violence would shock the city. On the 2nd of January 2003, a revenge attack by a rival mob called the Burger Bar Boys would result in the murder of 2 innocent girls and shock the city and the nation. The incident was sparked when the Burger Bar Boys spotted their rivals, the Johnson crew, at a party held at a hair salon. They decided to attack them in a drive-by shooting.
The woman who ran the hair salon had had this New Year's Day party for the last few years. It was well known, so they tagged along, And the party, by all accounts, was, a normal affair. There was nothing unusual about it until the early hours of the morning when people reported that the atmosphere started getting very dark. There was rumours around that there's going to be trouble, something's going to happen.
The car pulled into position, not far from the party. Inside, 3 members of the Burger Bar Boys were armed, one of them with a Mac-10 machine gun.
At 4 o'clock in the morning, the place was winding up. People were piling out the back and basically just getting some fresh air.
So the party spills out onto the street. Within a split second, 23 empty cartridges are spewed out from the machine gun. Charlene Ellis was the first to die, hit 3 times. Letitia Shakespeare was also killed, hit 4 times. I went to see Letitia's mother, Marcia, who had to go and identify her daughter only hours after the shooting.
As soon as I went into the room, I could see Letitia, she had a hairpiece on that day. And I could see that was like slinched to one side. I thought, well, this is Letitia. So I came round to have a look, and she was there on the bed, but her eyes were wide open.
Really?
I've never seen her eyes that wide open.
Yeah.
And I still couldn't absorb that she was dead. I still thought she was alive. I said, no, she's alive. Her eyes are open. She's got to be alive. And when I was walking around and looking, and when I looked, because her eyes were so open, you could see like where like the blood shot, like the shock initially just killed her. She didn't have time to even close her eyes. That horror stopped with me for about 4 weeks. I kept having nightmares, panic attacks, just couldn't. Thought, nah, that hasn't happened. I didn't really think it happened.
You can't believe it. You just can't take it in when something like that happens, can you?
No, I couldn't.
To the gangs, violence is just a way of life. Most of us remain unaware of it. But when it flares up and takes an innocent life, we are barely able to comprehend how this can be happening on our streets.
How do you eliminate gangs? Well, one way is to remove their source of income. Look what happened to the prohibition of alcohol in America. When liquor was legalized again, the gangsters were forced to move off into other business. Another method was to target the gangsters themselves. This was the strategy used in the 1920s to eliminate the gangs of Sheffield.
The local authorities were under pressure. They'd been ignoring the issues for a couple of years. It became apparent that they were going to have to do something. The police formed a special duties squad, colloquially known as the Flying Squad.
They appointed a new chief constable. He would become Britain's first gangbuster. His name was Percy Silito. Aged 38, Silito was an unorthodox choice. He'd left England to become a trooper in the African police, working in a tough and brutal regime which kept control over native tribes. Now, back in England, Silito would apply the same methods.
He knew the name of every police officer in the force. They knew that they could go out and take war to the gangs and that the chief constable would be right behind them.
So why was this any different to the police force before? They were bigger guys.
They were bigger guys, and they went to publicans and they told them, don't serve gang members. If you serve gang members, we'll oppose your licence. If they saw gang members in the pubs, they hauled them out and battered them. Really? There was no human rights.
So this was just another gang, really?
Effectively, they'd be fire with fire, steel with steel.
Silito brought in men like PC Pat Geraghty, who stood 6'5" and could hold 7 tennis balls in one hand. Silito also introduced the European Jiu-Jitsu champion Harry Hunter to train the force in self-defence. After 7 weeks, each man could deal with 60 methods of attack.
The Flying Squad threw people through windows, they threw them through doors without opening them first. They battered people in public view. They took them around the back occasionally, but they didn't take any prisoners if they didn't need to.
Silito was seen at the time as a great success. He became Britain's first gangbuster and was also sent up to Glasgow. During the 1930s, the Billy Boys remained the most powerful gang in Glasgow. Marching behind their leader, Billy Fullerton, they set out to taunt the Catholic neighbourhoods.
The Billy Boys came marching down this street, Norman Street, inflaming the Catholic locals with their music.
A large Catholic razor gang, known as the Norman Conks, who lived in this street, often prepared to retaliate when they heard the Billy Boys approaching.
The Norman Conks knew they were coming, heard they were coming because they weren't creeping up on them, and would ambush them. So from the windows, from roofs, if they could get onto them, they would attack them, throw missiles, throw bottles, throw dirt, anything at all, human waste. And then down in the street, there would be a battle royal going on.
But by 1935, the Glasgow police, now under the command of gangbuster Percy Silito, set out to ambush the gangs.
Police mounted a charge led by Silito's Cossacks, as his force were known. It was the beginning of the end for the Billy Boys.
Silito ordered the mounted police to Celtic Park, together with 2 large covered vans filled with policemen. They hid down a side street. There they waited.
But they were clever with it. They didn't wade in at the height of battle. They waited until both sides had more or less worn each other out, and then the police would come in and mop it up in a far more ferocious way on occasion.
This road here became littered with casualties. The police had broken up the parade, scoring an historic victory. According to Silito, only one of the Billy Boys escaped without injury. It was Elijah Cooper, the big drum player, who hid in his drum until he could surrender peacefully.
Today, gang-related crimes can be the most complicated to solve. Often it's hard to work out just who's innocent and who's guilty, who's in one faction and who's in another. In Birmingham, Police officers collected 1,300 statements, recovered 40 vehicles, and put tens of thousands of man-hours into bringing down the murderers of Charlene Ellis and Letitia Shakespeare. To put away the Gooch Gang in Manchester, prosecution lawyers scrutinised 50,000 pages of evidence, 80,000 mobile phone calls, and offered unprecedented protection to witnesses in order for them to talk. It paid off. The Gooch Gang were put away for a very long time. Only with this level of investigation can gangs be brought to justice. Even Curtis Warren, who often appeared to be one step ahead with his drug trafficking empire, was eventually cornered. On October the 24th, 1996, Dutch SWAT units raided a warehouse in Holland and Warren's home.
And through a complex kind of undercover surveillance operation involving wiretaps, they managed to catch him red-handed, bringing in another superload of cocaine.
The top 5 men in Warren's drug ring were among the 10 men dragged from their beds and arrested. The police confiscated 400 kilograms of cocaine, 60 kilos of heroin, 1,500 kilos of cannabis, and 50 kilos of ecstasy. Their street value, £125 million. Simultaneously, British police searched premises across northwest England to arrest the gang's other cohorts.
He goes to trial, it stacks up, and he goes to jail for a long time.
During this series, I've been walking around some of the estates. I saw the same problems that existed 100 years ago. I see kids with nothing to do, locked into cul-de-sacs that they just can't escape from. It's almost impossible for them to go anywhere unnoticed. Many are from traditional immigrant families, desperate to find their own identity out on the street, where it's all about respect, and sometimes violence.
So where do we go from here? Where's the Percy Silito of the 21st century? Well, let me tell you, it's right here. Strathclyde's Violence Reduction Unit.
I'm about to meet Karen McCluskey. She's a director of this unit, which she set up in 2008. She's responsible for bringing about a radical new approach in tackling gangs. She did what no one had ever dared do before. She hauled in all the gangs and laid down the law to them.
We wanted to try and make a big change because you can't just take 10 people. It has to be about hundreds to achieve a real big shift in gangs.
So how'd you do that?
We had to get the parents, we had to get the schools, we had to convince them to come in.
So you were putting rival gangs in the same
all of them. I mean, this was about, it's a really risky strategy. And the chief stood up and we flashed their pictures around the room. And we said, we know who you are, we know where you live. And he said, I'm so powerful, I can have them all outside your front door if I so wish, my corpse. I can make your life really difficult. It's not hard, but we want you to stop. We want you to stop this because I don't want to go and see your parents and tell them that you're dead or they're coming to arrest you for a murder. And then we get a surgeon to stand up and he says, you boys might not know what you're doing, but let me tell you what I get in my surgery. And he shows them the pictures. And some of them are really graphic, but that's what he says, we have some of the worst cases of facial injury anywhere in the world here. They cannot look at it. And we have had a few fainters. And then I suppose the best and the worst part is we get a mum to stand up. And it is just, unless you'd seen it, it's very difficult to explain. But she stands up and she says, you boys might not care about yourself, but here's what happened to my son when I cradled him when he died. And I go into his room every single day and I will never get over it. It's destroyed my husband, it's destroyed my family, and I cared about my son. And you could hear a pin drop in the courtroom.
I know exactly
and
where
you
you're
can
coming from.
You can hear them sobbing in the back. Because regardless of how beleaguered some of these families are, they love their mothers.
Yeah.
And it's the most powerful thing ever. And we then say, make a choice. You can make a choice here. And the really interesting thing is, for lots of the people that we deal with, they've got no choice about where they're born, what parents they're born to, what school they go to, even what gang they go into. This sometimes is the first time in their life that they've had a choice. And it is amazing how many of them stand up in the court and say, I want out.
I tell you, I can't... I'm shocked at what I've just seen in there. Karen off camera showed us some CCTV footage of some gang violence, but real gang violence. It kind of hit home what this show's all about. It was just sickening to see kids acting like that. And it's places like this that are working towards kind of fixing the problem. I'm still not convinced that it's a problem that can be fixed. I think it goes a lot deeper down than just the one gang, you know, trying to take knives away, or I think it's ingrained, the problem. Listen, we can only hope.
100 years ago, lads on the street in a poor area had few prospects and no real voice or rights. Joining a gang gave them a sense of belonging. The authorities pinpointed poor housing, lack of family control, and boredom as key causes. This still holds true today.
But the big difference now is that many gangs deal in drugs, and the drugs they sell contaminate their neighbourhood, blighting the futures of those who touch them.
Gangs will only stop selling drugs when the demand is removed. And only education or a change in the law can alter that.
Many of the cities we've looked at in the course of this series have seen major gangs put away for a very long time. And with targeted policing, education and social initiatives, there's been a fall in violent gang crime. Let's hope it stays that way.